February 1945. The war in the Pacific is nearing its final brutal stages. The once proud Imperial Japanese Army has been pushed back on every front, and the Allies are marching steadily toward victory. Amid the destruction of war-torn cities and the overwhelming chaos of a collapsing empire, a group of Japanese women prisoners of war are escorted across the barren landscape of the Philippines. These women, taken captive by the American forces after years of serving in various military and civilian roles, are exhausted, their spirits broken by the horrors of conflict. The cold wind cuts through their thin clothing as they march, their bare feet raw and bleeding from the harsh terrain. The once pristine streets of their homeland are a distant memory, and all that remains is the raw, painful reality of survival. These women, forced into the brutal system of war, now find themselves at the mercy of their captors. Soldiers they had once been taught to fear, if not outright despise. And then, in the midst of the bitter cold, a surprising act of humanity unfolds. As they stand in the dirt, shivering and uncertain of what the future holds, American soldiers approach them. In their hands, they hold something unexpected. New shoes, simple, practical, and desperately needed. For the Japanese women, the gesture is so shocking, so out of step with the brutality of the past few years, that they stand frozen in disbelief. Tears well up in their eyes as they are handed shoes, small but symbolic tokens of kindness in the aftermath of war. The weight of this moment is not just about the physical comfort of their new shoes, but about the humanity behind the gesture. These women, who had been dehumanized and reduced to mere prisoners of war, are suddenly treated as human beings in a way they never thought possible. And in that moment, the unthinkable happens. Their captors, the enemy they had been taught to fear, have shown them kindness. By February 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final stages. The Allied forces, having already won decisive battles in places like Midway, Guadalcanal, and Iwo Jima, were now focused on securing the Philippines, a crucial stepping stone toward Japan's home islands. The Japanese, weakened by years of fighting and the overwhelming might of the American war machine, were desperate to defend what little they had left. As the Allies closed in on the Philippines, they found themselves facing not only a military force on the verge of collapse, but also a country ravaged by war, struggling to maintain any semblance of normal life. For the Japanese people, the war had become a daily struggle for survival. After Japan's initial successes, the tide of battle had turned dramatically, and by 1944, the empire was on the defensive. The Imperial Japanese Army, once a formidable force, was now fighting a war of attrition, with shortages of manpower, resources, and supplies. The Japanese civilian population, many of whom had already been forced into the war effort, now found themselves in the midst of air raids, bombings, and the constant threat of invasion. It was a time of immense hardship and suffering, not just for the soldiers but for the women and children left behind. Many of the women who were captured by the U.S. forces in the Philippines had been forced into auxiliary military roles, providing support for the Japanese war effort in various capacities. These roles ranged from working in munitions factories to serving as nurses or supporting the troops on the front lines. They had been conscripted or volunteered out of a sense of duty to their country, just as men were conscripted to fight. But as the war stretched on, many of these women found themselves in increasingly dangerous situations, caught between the advancing Allied forces and a collapsing Japanese military. For the American forces, the invasion of the Philippines was part of a broader strategy to cripple Japan's war machine and pave the way for an eventual invasion of the Japanese home islands. By this time, the U.S. forces had mastered the art of amphibious warfare, and the Japanese were struggling to counter the overwhelming American technological and tactical superiority. The battle for the Philippines, while not as fierce as earlier campaigns like Iwo Jima, was still hard fought. It was here that many Japanese soldiers and civilians, including women, found themselves caught in the final stages of the war. When U.S. forces entered the Philippines, they captured tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers, as well as civilians who had been caught in the chaos of the war. Many of the women who had been captured by the American forces had spent years in fear and deprivation, only to find themselves prisoners in a foreign land. Their fate was uncertain, and while many had been taught to view the Americans as ruthless enemies, they soon realized that the reality was far more complex. For the U.S. military, the task of occupying Japan's former territories was not only a matter of securing military positions and defeating the enemy, it was also a moral and logistical challenge. American forces were required to manage thousands of prisoners, many of whom were civilians, and to provide them with basic necessities. The rules of engagement were no longer just about defeating the enemy. They now included treating prisoners with respect and dignity, as outlined by the Geneva Conventions. As the Allies gained ground in the Philippines and other occupied territories, American soldiers were faced with the plight of thousands of women who had been caught in the war's web. Despite being the enemy, these women were now suffering from the same hardships as the soldiers: inadequate food, exposure to the elements, and a lack of proper clothing and shoes. While the combat phase of the war was drawing to a close, the human cost was far from over. The decision to offer comfort to the captured women was not merely a strategic one, but a humane gesture that reflected the changing dynamics of the war's conclusion. In this final stage of the war, the American soldiers were dealing with the harsh realities of occupation, but they were also faced with the opportunity to show a different side of themselves, one that contrasted with the brutal combat they had experienced for years. The American soldiers, having endured their own suffering, now had the chance to offer a modicum of comfort to the very people who had once been their enemies. For the Japanese women who found themselves as prisoners of war in 1945, the reality was one of utter despair. Most of these women had not been active combatants. They were civilians conscripted into auxiliary roles, working in factories, hospitals, and other essential services to support the war effort. However, as the Allies advanced and the war turned in their favor, these women were swept up in the chaos. Now, prisoners of war, they faced not just the physical hardship of captivity, but the psychological toll of being caught between two opposing forces. These women were caught in a paradox. They had been forced into wartime roles that many did not fully understand or agree with, yet they were still seen as enemies by the advancing American forces. After years of hardship, they were now facing their captors, men they had been taught to hate. The brutality of the war had dehumanized both sides, but in their captivity, these women were forced to confront their new reality. They had no power, no voice, and no idea what would become of them. The physical conditions of the women prisoners were grim. The harsh winter of 1945 left them vulnerable to cold and malnutrition. Without sufficient clothing or proper footwear, their feet became raw and blistered from walking long distances over difficult terrain. Their bodies were exhausted from years of deprivation, and their spirits were broken from the trauma of conflict. Yet in this moment of desperation, something unexpected happened. They were given new shoes. This simple act, an item of necessity they had lacked for so long, became a symbol of both relief and bewilderment. In the midst of their suffering, the American soldiers provided them with something more than just a material gift. They provided them with dignity. The women, many of whom had been taught to despise the Americans, found themselves facing a radical shift in their understanding of the enemy. Here, in the most unlikely of circumstances, they were shown kindness by the very soldiers they had once feared. The gift of shoes in the freezing cold was an act that defied the brutal reality of war. It was a moment that forced the women to reckon with the complexity of their situation. Their captors were no longer faceless enemies, but human beings capable of empathy and compassion. For these women, receiving the shoes was both a moment of relief and a psychological turning point. It shattered their preconceived notions of their captors and made them realize that there was still room for humanity amidst the devastation of war. It was a moment that marked the beginning of a complicated process of reconciliation, one that would continue in the years to come as Japan struggled to rebuild. After its defeat, the decision to provide prisoners of war with supplies such as shoes was not merely a gesture of kindness. It was a calculated strategic move by the American military to foster goodwill and ensure stability during the post-war occupation of Japan and its territories. While the immediate goal of the U.S. military was to defeat Japan and secure its surrender, the larger task was to manage the post-war environment and begin the difficult work of rebuilding a war-torn nation. The American forces understood that their role extended beyond military victory. They were also responsible for the social and psychological reconstruction of a defeated people. By offering such basic comforts to the Japanese women POWs, the American soldiers were not just fulfilling humanitarian obligations. They were engaging in a form of psychological warfare that would have long-lasting effects on the relationship between the U.S. and Japan. These acts of kindness, though small in the context of the larger war, sent a clear message. The Allies were not there to simply punish the Japanese. They were there to rebuild. This shift in strategy was important, as it aimed to prevent future hostilities and foster cooperation in the post-war world. The act of providing shoes to the women prisoners was also a practical decision. Many of these women had been forced to march for days without proper footwear, leading to physical exhaustion and injuries. Giving them shoes not only helped to alleviate the suffering caused by the brutal conditions, but also allowed them to move more freely, which was essential for the logistics of managing large numbers of prisoners. For the U.S. military, ensuring that the prisoners could function more effectively was part of a larger effort to maintain order and manage the transition to a post-war occupation. In addition to its practical benefits, the gesture also served a broader strategic purpose. By showing compassion to the prisoners, the U.S. military hoped to weaken the resolve of any remaining hardliners in Japan, while also ensuring that the civilian population was treated with respect. The image of American soldiers giving shoes to Japanese women was a powerful symbol of American superiority, not just in military might, but in their ability to offer mercy and compassion, even to their enemies. This strategic humanitarian approach, though seemingly simple, was part of a broader effort to ensure the stability of post-war Japan. The U.S. had recognized that Japan's future lay not just in military defeat, but in the rebuilding of its society. This moment of compassion toward Japanese women POWs, small as it was a seed of the long process of reconciliation between the two nations. Over time, it would contribute to the shift in American policy toward Japan, as the U.S. would play a central role in Japan's post-war economic and political recovery. The psychological toll of the war on the Japanese women who found themselves as POWs was immense. For many of these women, the war had robbed them of their youth, their safety, and their sense of identity. They had been conscripted or coerced into roles that placed them in the direct path of conflict. Some had worked in munitions factories, others had served in hospitals, while many were pressed into other support roles for the Japanese military. Yet, despite their contributions to the war effort, these women were not soldiers. They were civilians caught in the crossfire of a global conflict far beyond their control. The impact of the war on these women went beyond the physical hardships they endured. Many of them had witnessed the loss of family members, the destruction of their homes, and the disintegration of the very fabric of their society. They had lived through air raids, bombings, and the constant fear of invasion. For the women taken as POWs, the psychological burden of their wartime experiences was overwhelming. The trauma of being captured, combined with the isolation of captivity, often left them in a state of numbness or disbelief. The gift of shoes, given to them by the American soldiers, was not just a material act, it was a deeply emotional moment for the women. In the midst of their suffering, receiving shoes represented an unexpected act of kindness, something they had not anticipated from their captors. For these women, the shoes symbolized more than just warmth or comfort. They represented a flicker of humanity in a war that had stripped them of their dignity and sense of security. To be treated with kindness by the very soldiers they had been taught to fear was a powerful moment of psychological release. It was, in some sense, a moment of healing, a recognition that, despite the horrors of war, there was still room for compassion. The psychological effect of this act of kindness would be profound for many of the women. In a world where they had been treated as enemies, subjugated by the wartime roles they had been forced into, this gesture helped to rebuild their sense of identity as human beings. It allowed them to see beyond the uniform they had worn or the role they had played in the war effort. For the first time in years, they were treated not as soldiers or supporters of the enemy, but as individuals deserving of basic human dignity. This moment also set the stage for the long process of post-war reconciliation. The experience of receiving kindness from their captors made many of these women question the binary thinking that had shaped their understanding of the war. The act of receiving shoes was, in many ways, a turning point in their journey from victims of war to survivors who could begin to rebuild their lives in a world that was rapidly changing. For the U.S. soldiers who had extended this compassion, the psychological impact was just as significant. They were forced to confront the human cost of the war, and in doing so, they found a deeper connection to the people they had once fought against. The role of women in wartime Japan is often overlooked in traditional narratives of the Pacific War. While men fought on the front lines, the women of Japan were conscripted to serve in various capacities that were critical to the war effort. From the home front to the battlefield, women were seen as integral to Japan's military success. Yet, their contributions were often hidden in the shadows, defined by the roles they played behind the scenes, such as factory workers, nurses, and auxiliary service members. In the context of Japanese society at the time, women were expected to embody the virtues of loyalty and sacrifice for the emperor and the nation. Many of these women were trained to believe that their duty to the empire was paramount, and that their role in supporting the war was an extension of their patriotism. They were often taught to be self-sacrificing and obedient, placed in positions where their efforts were integral to the military machine, but rarely recognized for their work. For many of these women, the war was a personal journey of sacrifice and hardship. Some were forced into positions where they had to give up their families, homes, and livelihoods to contribute to the war effort. As Japan's defeat became inevitable, the women who had once been tasked with supporting the military now found themselves at the mercy of the American forces, their wartime roles making them targets of animosity and suspicion. The cultural expectations placed upon them as Japanese women were shattered by their capture and the harsh realities of war. The American soldiers, who had been trained to see them as part of the enemy machine, were now the ones offering them warmth, comfort, and care. This cultural shift, though small in comparison to the larger war effort, marked a significant turning point in how these women saw themselves and how they were viewed by others. It was a moment of reckoning, a time when the women, many of whom had never been allowed to express their individuality, found themselves seen not as tools of the war effort, but as human beings deserving of compassion. For the American soldiers, this shift also challenged their preconceived notions of the enemy. They had been taught to view the Japanese as ruthless combatants, but now they were faced with the stark reality that the enemy was not a monolithic force. The women, though part of the enemy's wartime apparatus, were also victims of the conflict, caught in a system of total war that demanded sacrifices from both sides. This moment of cultural reconciliation, however brief, opened a door to a new understanding, one that saw the humanity in both the captor and the captured. As the days passed in the bleak aftermath of war, the world began to shift its focus from the destruction of the battlefield to the healing of broken societies. The women, once caught in the violent machinery of the war, now found themselves in a new and unfamiliar role, as prisoners of the very forces they had been taught to fear. Yet, as their captors, the American soldiers, moved among them, the mood shifted. These soldiers, who had once been their adversaries, began to offer a sense of kindness that was as unexpected as it was transformative. The turning point came one cold, miserable afternoon as the women, exhausted from their grueling march and battle-hardened experiences, gathered in a small camp set up by the American forces. They had been stripped of their belongings, their dignity, and their previous lives. Their feet were raw, their bodies frail, and their spirits broken. The cold of winter cut through their thin clothing, and they had not known the comfort of a warm meal or dry shelter for days. As they huddled together, waiting for their next orders, the Americans approached with a surprising sight: boots, shoes, and warm clothing. The soldiers, whose orders had been to maintain order and security, had taken the extra step of providing something they hadn't been instructed to: warmth and comfort for their prisoners. The sight of American soldiers handing out shoes to Japanese women, many of whom had spent months or even years enduring the brutalities of the war, was utterly disorienting. The women who had been captured in the wake of Japan's military collapse were now offered something more than just basic survival. They were offered compassion. For the Japanese women, who had been taught to see the Americans as the embodiment of their nation's enemy, this moment of kindness was a stark contradiction to everything they had ever been told. The shoes, while a simple item in the context of the war, were a symbolic gift that offered more than just relief from the cold. They offered a moment of humanity in a world that had been stripped of it. These women, who had once been part of a regime that sought to conquer and destroy, were now receiving help from their former enemies. This was the turning point, the moment when the concept of the enemy began to unravel. For the American soldiers, the act of giving shoes to their former enemies was equally significant. These soldiers, who had seen their comrades die in brutal battles across the Pacific, were now faced with the stark contrast of war's aftermath. They had spent years fighting for their country's survival, but in this moment, they were forced to confront the human cost of the war. The Japanese women, once seen only through the lens of their enemy status, were now simply human beings, caught in the same turmoil that had affected the soldiers themselves. In that instant, the emotional and psychological complexities of the war began to unfold. The soldiers, having been trained for years to fight and kill, now found themselves in the position of offering mercy. They were witnessing, perhaps for the first time, the full humanity of those they had been taught to destroy. For the women, the act of receiving shoes from the very people they had been taught to hate was a disorienting realization. Their captors had become something more than just soldiers. They had become fellow human beings. This act of kindness shattered the binary of enemy versus ally that had defined their perceptions of each other throughout the war. The emotional and psychological weight of this moment was far-reaching. The Japanese women, who had lived through the brutality of the war and the horrors of their nation's defeat, were now given a glimpse of the compassion they had never expected. The soldiers, who had been hardened by battle, now found themselves grappling with the moral complexities of their victory. It was a moment of reckoning for both sides, one that would stay with them long after the war had ended. As the Japanese women, still in shock and disbelief, accepted the shoes from the American soldiers, the significance of the moment deepened. It was no longer just about the physical relief these shoes provided, but about the psychological shift it triggered in both the captives and their captors. This simple act of kindness, however small in the context of the overwhelming violence and destruction of war, was a gesture that would remain etched in the memories of all those involved. For the American soldiers, this act marked a profound emotional turning point. The brutal years of combat had hardened them, and they had grown accustomed to viewing the enemy through a lens of military strategy, where lives were often reduced to mere numbers or strategic targets. Yet, In that moment, they were forced to confront the humanity of those they had once fought against. These women, who had been conscripted into the war effort, were not the faceless enemy they had been taught to view them as, but individuals with stories of their own. The American soldiers, many of whom had lost comrades in the brutal Pacific theater, now found themselves extending a hand of mercy to those they had been taught to see as adversaries. For the Japanese women, the reality of their captivity was harsh. They had been stripped of their possessions, their homes, and their dignity in the wake of Japan's collapse. As they had been taught to hate and fear the Americans, they now found themselves in a position where their captors were offering something unexpected: care. The act of giving shoes was not just about the comfort it provided. It was about the acknowledgement of their suffering. The soldiers had recognized their humanity, offering a gesture that contradicted everything the women had been conditioned to believe about the enemy. For many of the women, the psychological weight of receiving something as simple as shoes was a powerful realization that their captors were not just the enemy. They were human beings, capable of empathy and kindness. This shift was especially significant given the context of the war. The Japanese were taught to view themselves as a superior force, and their enemy, especially the Americans, were portrayed as an inferior, even subhuman adversary. The idea of compassion, particularly from the Americans, was a concept that had never been part of the narrative they had been taught during the war. And yet, in the freezing winter of 1945, the American soldiers defied this narrative, offering warmth and comfort to the very people they had fought against. This was a moment of profound contrast between the brutality of war and the enduring power of mercy. For the soldiers, it was a quiet acknowledgement that, in the end, the war was not just about defeating an enemy. It was about rebuilding a fractured world. The gift of shoes became a symbol of the beginning of that process, a small act that signified the first step toward reconciliation and rebuilding after years of brutal conflict. The Japanese women, on the other hand, experienced a deep psychological shift. The war had stripped them of much, but it had also taught them to dehumanize those they fought against. In receiving this unexpected kindness, they were forced to reconsider everything they had been taught to believe about their enemies. The act of giving shoes was a pivotal moment, one that transcended the battlefield and marked the start of a new phase in the relationship between Japan and the United States. It was the moment when the harsh, unforgiving lines of war, lines that had separated the enemy from the Allies, the captor from the captive, began to blur. The American soldiers, who had once been seen as brutal invaders, now became agents of mercy, and the Japanese women, who had once been seen as part of the war effort, were now viewed through a more empathetic lens. The aftermath of this moment would resonate far beyond the immediate exchange. For the women, it became a part of their personal journey from victims of war to survivors. This moment of compassion, small as it was, allowed them to begin the healing process, to rebuild their sense of identity in a world that had been broken by years of violence. For the soldiers, it marked a chance to reconcile the brutality of war with the compassion that existed even within the harshest of circumstances. It was a recognition that war, in its final moments, could leave room for mercy, for understanding, and for humanity to emerge from the shadows of destruction. As both sides moved forward, the psychological and emotional consequences of this turning point would continue to reverberate. For the American soldiers, this moment of kindness marked the end of one chapter of war and the beginning of a new era of peacebuilding. For the Japanese women, the receipt of shoes was more than just a physical comfort. It was a reminder that, even in the darkest moments of war, humanity could still shine through. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the once sharply defined lines between captor and captive began to blur. The gesture of providing shoes to Japanese women prisoners, while a small act in the grand context of the conflict, became emblematic of a larger, more profound shift in how the Allies, particularly the United States, sought to rebuild a fractured world. The war was over, And while victory had been achieved on the battlefield, the task of reconciling nations, restoring dignity, and addressing the deep psychological scars left by years of brutal combat was just beginning. For the American soldiers, this moment marked a transition from warriors in combat to agents of reconstruction. They had fought valiantly, endured hardship, and witnessed the destruction of entire cities. But in giving shoes to Japanese women prisoners, they had taken a step toward acknowledging the human cost of the war, recognizing that their actions would define the future of the relationship between their nations. In that seemingly small act of kindness, they were not just offering physical comfort. They were offering a message of hope, compassion, and a desire for healing. It was an acknowledgement that, despite the brutal history, peace could still be forged in the quietest of moments. For the Japanese women, the aftermath was equally transformative. They had been caught in a war they had little control over, suffering unimaginable hardships as civilians conscripted into roles that ranged from supporting military operations to enduring the devastation of bombings and occupation. Now, as prisoners of war, they were forced to confront their new reality. Their captors were not the faceless enemy they had been taught to fear, but human beings who, in a rare moment of humanity, offered them the simplest comfort: warmth. The shoes became more than just a necessity. They were a symbol of survival, of dignity, and of the possibility for change. However, the psychological toll on the women was far from over. The emotional scars of war would take time to heal, as would the social stigmas that often followed those associated with Japan's wartime actions. Many of these women had lost loved ones, homes, and their former sense of identity. The act of receiving shoes did not erase the years of hardship, nor did it provide immediate resolution to the deeper wounds inflicted by war. But it offered something important: the recognition of their humanity by those they had once considered enemies. It was a reminder that in the aftermath of war, there was still room for compassion, and that even in the most harrowing circumstances, there could be the possibility of kindness and reconciliation. As Japan faced the daunting task of rebuilding after its defeat, the relationship between Japan and the United States began to evolve. The American forces, who had been occupying Japan and its territories, now had the task of not just overseeing the military surrender, but helping to reconstruct a broken nation. The psychological damage from years of war, the loss of national pride, and the need for societal healing were all factors that the U.S. would have to contend with as they oversaw the occupation and eventual democratization of Japan. It was a delicate process, one that required both political and social strategies to foster trust and cooperation. For the women who had been prisoners, the aftermath meant rebuilding their lives from the ashes of the war. The American gesture of kindness was one of many small steps that would allow these women to regain a sense of self-worth and dignity. In the years that followed, the relationship between Japan and the United States would evolve from one of bitter animosity to cooperation. The U.S. would play a significant role in Japan's post-war economic recovery, and while the scars of the past would never fully disappear, the willingness to move forward would lay the foundation for the new world order that emerged in the second half of the 20th century. The aftermath of the war and the emotional and psychological journey that followed was as much about the personal recovery of those who had suffered as it was about the rebuilding of nations. For Japan, the post-war years were not simply a matter of reconstructing cities and restoring infrastructure. They involved a far deeper process of healing and reconciliation, both internally and with the rest of the world. The war had left the nation physically shattered, economically crippled, and psychologically scarred. Yet, despite the devastation, Japan embarked on a remarkable journey of recovery, a journey that would be shaped in part by the very acts of kindness extended by their American captors. For the Japanese women, particularly those who had been prisoners of war, the aftermath was a deeply personal struggle. They were not just recovering from the physical effects of war wounds, illnesses, and exhaustion, but from the trauma of being caught in a conflict that stripped them of their identities. Many of these women had been caught up in the war effort, conscripted or coerced into military and support roles. They had seen their loved ones perish, their homes destroyed, and their world upended. Their wartime experiences left deep scars that would take years, even decades, to heal. The act of receiving shoes, seemingly simple, yet deeply symbolic, was a moment of psychological relief in a long and difficult road to recovery. The gift of shoes represented more than just an immediate relief from the cold. It marked the beginning of a process where the women, who had been reduced to prisoners of war and seen as mere instruments of the enemy, could begin to see themselves as more than just victims. It was a reminder that despite everything they had endured, they were still human beings deserving of dignity and care. The shoes, in this sense, acted as a catalyst for the restoration of self-worth. The deep emotional impact of such a small gesture would resonate with the women for the rest of their lives. It was a turning point, marking the shift from being an enemy to being a person, an individual with feelings, hopes, and the potential for healing. For the American soldiers, the aftermath of the war and this act of kindness carried its own emotional weight. The soldiers who had spent years fighting, witnessing the horrors of war, and losing comrades now found themselves in a position to offer comfort and humanity to those they had once considered enemies. The act of giving shoes to the Japanese women was not just an exercise in humanitarian aid. It was a recognition that the war, while fought for noble purposes, had left everyone affected by it with wounds that went beyond the physical. These soldiers had been hardened by battle, but the acts of mercy they extended in those final days spoke to the enduring power of compassion and the need to recognize the humanity in all people, even those who had once been considered the enemy. The larger significance of the American soldiers offering shoes to Japanese women lay in its symbolism for the future. It wasn't just an isolated act of kindness. It was a microcosm of the change in global dynamics that was taking place. As the Allies defeated the Axis powers and occupied former enemy territories, the challenge of post-war diplomacy and reconstruction would require more than just military victory. It required the rebuilding of relationships, the healing of deep-rooted wounds, and the offering of mercy and reconciliation. For Japan and the United States, this act of kindness, in its quiet simplicity, marked the beginning of the difficult but necessary process of moving forward together. The eventual American occupation of Japan and the subsequent rebuilding efforts were shaped by the recognition that the war was not just a military contest, but a contest of ideologies, cultures, and human decency. The lessons learned from moments of compassion, like the gift of shoes, would inform the post-war reconstruction efforts. The U.S. military, while initially seen as occupiers, would come to play a crucial role in the reconstruction of Japan, both economically and politically. The two nations, once bitter enemies, would find common ground in their mutual desire for peace and stability. Japan's recovery after the war was remarkable. Despite the initial devastation, the country rose from the ashes, transforming itself into one of the world's leading economic powers. The influence of the United States in shaping Japan's post-war government and economy, through policies such as democratization and industrial recovery, cannot be overstated. This process, though fraught with challenges, was in part built on the foundations of understanding and compassion that began to take root during the early days of the occupation. The seeds of this understanding were planted in moments like the exchange of shoes, where humanity transcended the roles of captor and captive, enemy and ally. For the Japanese women who had been prisoners of war, the aftermath of their captivity was a journey of both physical and emotional rehabilitation. The trauma they had endured would never be fully erased, but as the years passed, they found themselves part of a new Japan, one that had been rebuilt and redefined by the experiences of the war. Their role in post-war Japan would evolve from that of victims to survivors, and eventually they would be seen as important contributors to the rebuilding of the country. Many of the women who had been part of the wartime effort, now survivors, would find new roles in the peaceful, post-war society that Japan was striving to become. For the American soldiers, their role in the aftermath was also transformative. Having fought for years against an enemy, they were now tasked with the difficult and delicate work of rebuilding a shattered nation. The kindness shown to the Japanese women was a small part of a larger effort to bring stability and peace to a world that had been forever altered by the war. It was a reminder that even in the most difficult circumstances, compassion and humanity could still find a way to emerge, offering hope for a better future. The act of giving shoes to Japanese women prisoners of war, though seemingly small in the grand scope of the Pacific War, encapsulates the profound complexities of humanity that often emerge in the aftermath of conflict. In a time when the world was grappling with the devastation of total war, this moment of kindness stood as a quiet defiance to the brutality of the conflict. The gift of shoes was not merely about providing comfort to those in need. It was a symbolic gesture that spoke to the possibility of reconciliation, compassion, and healing amidst the wreckage of war. For the American soldiers who offered the shoes, this simple act represented a recognition that victory in war was not the end of the journey. It was merely the beginning of the long and difficult task of rebuilding the world and mending the relationships torn apart by violence. The soldiers, who had endured years of combat and loss, now found themselves in a position to offer mercy to those they had once fought against. This moment of compassion marked a shift in the way the American soldiers viewed their role in the post-war world. Not as conquerors, but as partners in the healing process, striving to rebuild a broken world. For the Japanese women, the shoes were a reminder that, even in the darkest times, humanity could find a way to shine through. These women had been conscripted, caught in the tide of war, and forced to serve a cause they had little control over. Their world had been shattered by the conflict, and yet, in that moment of receiving shoes from their captors, they were reminded that even their enemies could show kindness and compassion. The emotional weight of this gesture was immense. It represented a moment of psychological release, an opportunity to regain a sense of dignity in the wake of war's horrors. The women who had been dehumanized and reduced to mere prisoners were now offered something far more important than just footwear. They were offered respect and empathy. This moment, though fleeting in time, was a profound turning point. It marked the beginning of the long process of post-war healing for both the United States and Japan. The physical wounds of the war would take years to heal, but the emotional scars could begin to fade as the two nations slowly transitioned from enemies to allies. The relationship between the U.S. and Japan, once defined by bitterness and resentment, began to shift toward cooperation and mutual respect. The kindness shown to Japanese prisoners, many of whom had been the victims of their own country's wartime propaganda, became a foundational part of the rebuilding process that would shape the future of both nations. For the world, this moment of humanity stands as a reminder that, even in the most brutal chapters of history, the power of compassion can break through the darkest of times. It is easy to focus on the destruction wrought by war, but moments like the one in which American soldiers gave shoes to their former enemies remind us that, in the aftermath of violence, there is still room for hope, for reconciliation, and for the rebuilding of human dignity. The gift of shoes to the Japanese women was a simple act, but its significance cannot be overstated. It was a reminder that, despite the brutalities of war, compassion and mercy can endure. In the end, the act of giving shoes represented more than just a material gift. It was a moment that transcended national boundaries, a moment where enemies became human beings, and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of war's horrors. The aftermath of World War II left the world with many questions about the nature of conflict, power, and peace. Yet, As this story shows, the answers do not always lie in the victory of one side over another, but in the capacity to rise above animosity and extend a hand of humanity. It was a small, yet powerful reminder that in the darkest moments of history, there is always room for kindness, compassion, and hope.